They made me serve coffee at my father's funeral while my siblings sat with the mourners. Then the CIA director walked in and asked for Agent Martinez. The room went silent when she realized I was holding the coffee pot. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The phone call came at 3 in the morning. Miguel shook me awake, his 15-year-old voice cracking as he whispered that someone was asking for me. I stumbled to the kitchen of our tiny Tucson apartment, still half asleep, and pressed the cold receiver to my ear. Carlos was on the other end, his voice flat and businesslike as always. "Dad's gone, Sophia. Heart attack. Funerals Thursday at St. Anthony's Cess. Mom wants you to help with the reception. You know, serve food, clean up, make yourself useful for once." I stood there in my pajamas, staring at the cracked linoleum floor, waiting for something to hit me. Grief, shock, anger, but all I felt was that familiar hollow ache, the one that had lived in my chest for 15 years. Ever since I walked away from Phoenix and everything I'd ever known. Ever since I became someone my family could never understand. Miguel appeared in the doorway, rubbing his eyes. His dark hair stuck up in all directions, and for a moment he looked exactly like I did at his age. Before the world got complicated, before I learned that some truths are too dangerous to share, even with the people you love most. "What's wrong, Mom? Your grandfather passed away, Mijo?" He nodded slowly, processing. Miguel had only met his grandfather a handful of times. My fault, maybe, or maybe it was just the natural consequence of building a life in the shadows, where even your family doesn't know who you really are. "Are we going to Phoenix?" I looked at my son, this beautiful boy who thought his mother was a failed college dropout who worked as a freelance translator to pay the bills, who had no idea that the woman making him breakfast every morning had spent the last decade and a half in places that didn't exist on any map, doing things that would never make it into any official record. "Yes, we're going to Phoenix." The drive from Tucson took 2 hours, plenty of time to remember why I'd stayed away so long. Miguel dozed in the passenger seat while I navigated the familiar highways, watching the desert landscape blur past. The Sonoran Desert looked the same as it always had, all saguaro cacti and endless blue sky, but I felt like I was traveling backward through time with every mile marker. Phoenix had grown since I left. New subdivisions sprawled across what used to be empty land, cookie-cutter houses with red tile roofs and 3-car garages. The kind of houses Diana lived in now with her investment banker husband. The kind of success my family understood and respected. We reached Maryvale in the early afternoon, and nothing had changed in my childhood neighborhood. Same small houses with chain-link fences. Same corner store where Mrs. Vasquez still swept the sidewalk every morning. Same feeling that dreams came here to die quietly in the desert heat. The Martinez family home sat on a corner lot, a modest ranch-style house with a front yard more dirt than grass. Dad's old pickup truck was still parked in the driveway, and I had to grip the steering wheel tighter to keep my hands from shaking. Miguel woke up as I pulled to the curb. "This is where you grew up? This is it." He studied the house with curious eyes, probably wondering how someone could leave a place like this and somehow end up with even less. If only he knew the truth. If only any of them knew. Diana's black Mercedes was already in the driveway, parked next to Carlos's white Lexus SUV. My siblings had done well for themselves, and they never let anyone forget it. Diana had climbed the corporate ladder at a Fortune 500 company, married money, and now lived in Scottsdale with a swimming pool and a maid. Carlos had built a real estate empire, flipping houses and developing strip malls across the valley. They were the success stories, the ones who made something of themselves. And then there was Sophia, the disappointment, the one who'd gotten a full scholarship to Arizona State and somehow managed to throw it all away. The one who'd disappeared for months at a time without explanation, who never seemed to have any money despite claiming to work as a translator, who'd had a baby with some man she refused to talk about, and now lived like a ghost on the edges of the family. Miguel and I walked to the front door together. I raised my hand to knock, then stopped. This used to be my home. I'd lived here for 18 years, had my own room, my own key, but that was before. Before I became Agent Martinez, before I learned that serving your country sometimes means losing your family. The door opened before I could knock. Diana stood there in a perfectly tailored black dress, her hair styled in an expensive cut that probably cost more than I spend on groceries in a month. She looked me up and down, taking in my Target jeans and worn sneakers, and her mouth tightened in disapproval. "Sophia, you made it." She didn't hug me. She didn't invite me in, she just stood there blocking the doorway like I was a stranger asking for directions. "This is Miguel," I said, putting my hand on my son's shoulder. "He's grown since you last saw him." Diana glanced at Miguel with polite disinterest. "Of course, hello Miguel." She stepped aside finally, but not before adding, "Mom's in the kitchen. She could use help with the food prep for tomorrow." The house smelled like pine sol and grief. Mom sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by casserole dishes and sympathy cards, her gray hair pulled back in the same simple ponytail she'd worn my entire childhood. She looked up when I entered, and for a moment her face softened. "Mija, you came." "Of course I came, Mama." She stood and hugged me, and I breathed in her familiar scent of Dove soap and vanilla perfume. But the embrace was brief, almost guilty, like she was embarrassed to show affection in front of Diana and Carlos, who had followed us into the kitchen. Carlos looked exactly like Dad had at his age, broad-shouldered and serious, but where Dad had worked with his hands, Carlos worked with contracts and building permits. He wore khakis and a polo shirt even to discuss funeral arrangements, always ready for his next business meeting. "Good, you're here," he said without preamble. "We need help tomorrow. Diana's handling the service logistics, I'm dealing with the burial arrangements, and Mom can't do everything herself. What do you need me to do?" Carlos exchanged a glance with Diana. "Well, someone needs to handle the reception. Set up tables, serve food, make sure there's enough coffee. You know the practical stuff." The practical stuff.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
That's what I'd become to them. The family member you called when you needed manual labor, not emotional support, not because you valued their presence, but because you needed an extra pair of hands. Miguel shifted uncomfortably beside me. He wasn't used to seeing his mother treated like hired help, probably because he'd never seen me interact with my family before. In his world, I was the parent who helped with homework and made sure he got to school on time, and somehow always managed to keep food on the table even when money was tight. He didn't know that to my family, I was the cautionary tale, the reminder of what happened when you didn't live up to expectations. "Sure," I said quietly. "I can handle the reception." Diana smiled, but it wasn't warm. It was the smile she probably used with employees who'd finally agreed to work overtime. "Perfect, the church hall is available after the service. Mrs. Vasquez is bringing her famous tamales, and the ladies from Mom's prayer group are handling the main dishes. You'll just need to make sure everything's set up properly and that people have what they need." "What about flowers?" I asked. Diana waved her hand dismissively, "Already taken care of. Carlos ordered a beautiful arrangement from the whole family. Your name's on the card too." My name was on the card. How generous of them to include me in their grand gesture, even though I hadn't been consulted or asked to contribute. Just another reminder that in this family, I was an afterthought at best. Miguel tugged on my sleeve. "Mom, where should I put our bags?" Diana looked surprised. "You're staying here?" "Just for tonight," I said. "We'll head back to Tucson after the service tomorrow." Carlos frowned. "There's not really room. Diana and David are in the guest room, and I'm on the couch." "It's fine," Mom interjected quietly. "Sophia can take her old room. Miguel can use the air mattress, my old room." I wondered if it still had my high school honor roll certificates on the wall, the ones that used to make Dad so proud. Back when he thought I was going to be the first in the family to graduate college, maybe become a teacher or a nurse. Something respectable. Something he could brag about to his friends at the plant. Miguel and I dragged our overnight bags down the narrow hallway. My childhood bedroom was exactly as I'd left it 15 years ago, frozen in time like a shrine to the daughter who'd had so much potential. The Arizona State University pennant still hung above my twin bed. My books were still lined up on the shelves, textbooks from classes I'd never finished because I'd been recruited for something bigger, something I could never explain. Miguel sat on the bed and looked around with interest. This is really where you grew up. This is it. He picked up a framed photo from my nightstand. It showed the whole family at my high school graduation. Dad in his best shirt and tie, Mom beaming with pride, Diana and Carlos looking bored but obligated to attend. And me in the middle, 18 years old and full of dreams I never could have imagined would take me to places like Tehran and Moscow, and a dozen other cities I still couldn't name. You look happy here, Miguel said. I had no idea what was coming. That night, I lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around its foundation. The same creaks and sighs I'd grown up with. The acoustic backdrop of a childhood that felt like it had belonged to someone else. Through the thin walls, I could hear Carlos on the phone in the living room, probably talking business even at midnight. Diana and her husband David were murmuring quietly in the guest room, making plans for their drive back to Scottsdale the day after the funeral. None of them knew that less than a month ago, I'd been in a safe house in Budapest, debriefing from an operation that had prevented a terrorist attack on American soil. They didn't know that I spoke 4 languages fluently and could kill a man with my bare hands if necessary. They didn't know that I'd been awarded the Intelligence Star twice for exceptional service, or that my work had saved thousands of lives over the years. To them, I was just Sophia who'd screwed up her life and never quite figured out how to fix it. Miguel was asleep on the air mattress, his breathing deep and even. He looked so young, so peaceful. Sometimes I wondered if I'd made the right choice, bringing him into this half-life of mine. He deserved better than a mother who couldn't tell him the truth about who she really was, what she really did when she disappeared for weeks at a time on translation jobs. But what was the alternative? Tell a 15-year-old that his mother was a CIA operative? Explain that the reason we moved so often when he was little wasn't because I was unreliable, but because I was protecting him from the kind of people who might use a child to get to an agent. Help him understand that every birthday party I'd missed, every school play I'd had to leave early, was because somewhere in the world, Americans were safer because of work I couldn't discuss. No, better to let him think I was a failure than to burden him with secrets that could get him killed. The morning of the funeral dawned clear and hot, typical Phoenix weather that made you feel like you were living inside an oven. I got up early and helped Mom prepare food for the reception while Diana got her hair done, and Carlos dealt with last-minute arrangements at the cemetery. Mrs. Vasquez arrived at 9 with 3 dozen tamales and a hug that lasted longer than any greeting I'd received from my own family. She'd been our neighbor for 30 years, had watched me grow up, had always treated me like the daughter she'd never had. "Mija," she whispered in my ear. "Your father talked about you all the time. He was so proud." I pulled back to look at her. "Proud?" She nodded, glancing around to make sure we weren't overheard. "He never stopped bragging about his smart daughter who worked for the government. Said you were doing important work, even if you couldn't talk about it." My heart stopped. "He knew," Mrs. Vasquez smiled sadly. "Fathers know things, Sophia. He might not have understood exactly what you did, but he knew it mattered. He knew you were serving something bigger than yourself." I had to excuse myself and step outside for a moment, overwhelmed by the possibility that my father had seen through my cover story, had somehow recognized that his daughter was still the idealistic girl who'd wanted to make the world a better place, just in ways he'd never expected. The funeral service was scheduled for 11 at St. Anthony's Sen, the same church where I'd made my first communion, where I'd been confirmed, where my parents had been married 43 years ago. Miguel and I dressed in our best clothes, which weren't saying much, and walked the 6 blocks to the church together. The parking lot was already full when we arrived. Dad had been well liked in the neighborhood, respected for his work ethic and his willingness to help anyone who asked. People remembered him fixing their cars in his spare time, helping them move, showing up with tools when something needed repair. He'd been a good man, a simple man, and the community had turned out to honor him. Inside the church, Diana was directing traffic like a wedding planner, making sure the flowers were arranged properly and that family members were seated in the correct pews. She wore designer sunglasses even indoors and carried a leather handbag that probably cost more than I made in a month. "Sophia, there you are," she said when she spotted me. "The church ladies need help setting up the hall for after. Can you go make sure the tables are arranged correctly?" I looked toward the front of the church, where Dad's casket sat surrounded by flowers. I'd barely had a chance to pay my respects, to say goodbye to the man who'd taught me how to change a tire and balance a checkbook and treat people with dignity regardless of their station in life. "Can't it wait until after the service?" Diana's mouth tightened. "The reception starts immediately after the burial. Everything needs to be ready." So while my siblings sat in the front pew accepting condolences and basking in the sympathy of the community, I spent my father's funeral arranging folding tables and brewing coffee in the church kitchen. Miguel helped without complaint, stacking chairs and spreading tablecloths, probably wondering why his mother was working while everyone else was mourning. Through the kitchen window, I could see the service beginning. Father Rodriguez spoke about Dad's life, his dedication to family, his commitment to honest work and community service. I watched Diana dab at her eyes with a tissue, and Carlos nod solemnly as people shared memories of their father. And I stood in the kitchen, making sure there would be enough coffee for everyone afterward. The burial was a blur of desert sun and whispered prayers. I stood at the back of the group, gathered around the gravesite, holding Miguel's hand as we watched them lower my father into the dry Arizona earth. Diana and Carlos threw handfuls of dirt onto the casket, a final goodbye that felt both ritual and real. I didn't throw dirt. I just stood there thinking about the last time I'd seen Dad alive, 6 months ago when I'd driven up from Tucson for his birthday. He'd been sitting in his favorite chair, watching a baseball game and drinking a beer, and when I'd walked in he'd smiled like seeing me was the best part of his day. "How's work, Mia?" "It's good, Dad. Keeping busy." "Good, important to stay busy. Important to have purpose." At the time I'd assumed he was talking about the translation jobs I pretended to do. Now, thanks to Mrs. Vasquez, I wondered if he'd been talking about something else entirely. After the burial, everyone drove back to St. Anthony's for the reception. I was already in the church hall, arranging food on serving tables and making sure the coffee was hot when the mourners began to arrive. People filled their plates and found seats, sharing stories about Dad and offering comfort to Mom. I moved through the crowd with coffee pots, refilling cups and clearing empty plates, invisible in the way that service workers always are. People thanked me absently, if at all, their attention focused on my siblings, who held court at the head table like grieving royalty. Diana was telling a story about how Dad had taught her to drive, how patient he'd been when she'd been nervous about parallel parking. Carlos was sharing a memory about working construction with Dad one summer, learning the value of hard work and attention to detail. Neither of them mentioned that I'd existed. Miguel sat at a corner table, picking at a plate of food and watching his mother serve coffee to people who treated her like she was part of the catering staff rather than immediate family. I could see the confusion in his eyes, the dawning realization that the woman he'd always respected was somehow less valued by her own family than she was by her teenage son. I was refilling Father Rodriguez's coffee cup when I noticed the commotion near the entrance. Someone important had arrived, someone who was causing whispers and pointed glances throughout the room. I looked up from the coffee pot and felt my blood turn to ice water. Director Patricia Wells stood in the doorway of the church hall, scanning the crowd with the calm, assessing gaze I remembered from our briefings at Langley. She wore a simple black suit that probably cost more than my car, and she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who regularly briefed the President of the United States. She was supposed to be in Washington. She was supposed to have no idea that Agent Martinez was currently serving coffee at a funeral in Phoenix, Arizona. Our eyes met across the room, and I saw the moment of recognition, the slight nod that acknowledged 15 years of shared secrets and successful operations. Then she began walking toward me, and the conversations around us grew quieter as people sensed that something significant was happening. "Excuse me," she said in the clear, commanding voice I'd heard brief senators and cabinet members. "I'm looking for Agent Martinez." The coffee pot slipped from my hands and crashed to the floor, hot liquid spreading across the linoleum in a dark puddle. The sound echoed through the suddenly silent church hall like a gunshot. Every head turned toward us, every conversation stopped mid-sentence. Director Wells stood 3 feet away from me, her steel-gray eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that could cut glass. She looked exactly as I remembered from our last meeting 18 months ago, when she'd personally debriefed me after the Prague operation. Composed, unreadable, dangerous in the way that only people with real power could be. "I'm sorry," I stammered, grabbing napkins from a nearby table to clean up the spilled coffee. "I think you have me confused with someone else." The director tilted her head slightly, studying me with the patience of a predator who knew her prey had nowhere to run. Behind her I could see 2 men in dark suits standing near the entrance, their positions carefully chosen to block the exits. They weren't obvious about it, but I'd been trained to notice these things. They weren't here by accident. "No confusion, Agent Martinez." She spoke quietly, but her voice carried across the room with absolute clarity. "I need to speak with you. Now." Diana rose from the head table, her face a mask of bewilderment and growing irritation. "I'm sorry, but who are you? This is a private family gathering." Director Wells turned toward my sister with the kind of smile that political opponents learn to fear. "Patricia Wells, Central Intelligence Agency." She reached into her jacket and produced a leather credential case, flashing her identification with practiced efficiency. "I'm here on official business." The room erupted in whispers and gasps. Someone dropped a plate. Mrs. Vasquez crossed herself and muttered a prayer in Spanish. Father Rodriguez looked like he was wondering if he should call the police or start performing last rites. Carlos pushed back from his chair, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "This is ridiculous. Sophia works as a translator. She doesn't have anything to do with the CIA. Actually," Director Wells said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade, "Agent Martinez has been one of our most valuable operatives for the past 15 years. She's received commendations from 3 different directors, including myself." I felt the blood drain from my face. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. My cover was blown, my family was learning the truth in the worst possible way, and Miguel was sitting 10 feet away watching his entire world crumble. "There's been a mistake," I said desperately. "I think you should leave." The director studied me for a long moment, and I could see her calculating something behind those cold eyes. Then she reached into her briefcase and withdrew a manila envelope sealed with red wax. "Agent Martinez," she said formally, "by order of the President of the United States, you are hereby awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom for extraordinary service to your country in operations that cannot be publicly acknowledged but have prevented immeasurable loss of American lives." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the air conditioning seemed to stop humming. I stared at the envelope in her hands, unable to process what was happening. The Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor in the country. "For me, that's impossible," Diana whispered. "Sophia dropped out of college. She's never accomplished anything." Director Wells turned toward my sister with an expression that could have frozen the Sahara. "Agent Martinez graduated summa cum laude from the CIA training program at the age of 19. She speaks fluent Arabic, Farsi, Russian and Mandarin. She has successfully completed 43 classified missions on 4 continents. She has been instrumental in preventing terrorist attacks, dismantling weapons trafficking networks, and gathering intelligence that has shaped American foreign policy for over a decade. The words hit the room like bombs. I watched my family's faces transform from confusion to shock to something approaching horror. This wasn't the Sophia they knew. This wasn't the failure they'd written off years ago. Miguel stood up from his corner table, his teenage face pale with understanding. All those business trips, Mom. All those times you had to leave suddenly. You weren't translating documents. I looked at my son, this beautiful boy who was learning that his mother had lied to him about everything that mattered. The pain in his eyes was worse than any physical injury I'd sustained in the field. I was protecting you, I said quietly. All of you. Carlos laughed, but there was no humor in it. Protecting us? From what? By disappearing for months at a time, by letting us think you were a screw-up who couldn't hold down a real job. Director Wells stepped forward, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Agent Martinez has made sacrifices that none of you can comprehend. She has missed birthdays and holidays and family gatherings because she was serving her country in ways that would give you nightmares. She has put her life on the line repeatedly to keep Americans safe, including all of you. Diana found her voice first, sharp and cutting as always. If this is true, why didn't she tell us? Why did she let us believe she was a failure? Because that's what good operatives do. The director replied. They sacrifice their personal relationships to maintain operational security. They let their families think less of them to keep those families safe from retaliation. She turned back to me, and her expression softened almost imperceptibly. Agent Martinez, you've been out of contact for 6 months. We've been concerned. I've been taking care of my son, and grieving your father, she said gently. Robert Martinez was a good man. He contacted our office last year. You know. My heart stopped. What? He called the main switchboard, and eventually got transferred to my assistant. He said he didn't need to know any details, but he wanted us to know that he was proud of his daughter's service. He asked us to tell you that he understood why you couldn't come home more often. The church hall began to spin around me. Dad had known. He'd not only known, he'd reached out to my handlers to express his support. While I'd been torturing myself with guilt over missing family dinners and birthday parties, he'd been proud of the work I was doing. Mrs. Vasquez appeared beside me, her weathered hand gripping my arm for support. I told you, Mesha. Fathers know things. Director Wells opened the envelope and withdrew an ornate medal attached to a blue ribbon. The presidential seal gleamed gold in the fluorescent light of the church hall. Agent Sophia Martinez, for exceptional service to the United States of America in the global war on terror, for courage under fire in hostile territories, and for intelligence gathering that has prevented multiple terrorist attacks on American soil. You are awarded this Presidential Medal of Freedom. She placed the medal around my neck, and suddenly the weight of 15 years of secrecy seemed to lift from my shoulders. I wasn't the family disappointment anymore. I wasn't the daughter who'd thrown away her potential. I was Agent Martinez, and I'd served my country with honor. The room remained frozen in stunned silence until Miguel broke free from his corner table and ran to me. He wrapped his arms around my waist, and I could feel him trembling against me. I'm proud of you, Mom, he whispered. I've always been proud of you, even when I didn't understand. Diana and Carlos hadn't moved from their positions near the head table. They looked like they'd been struck by lightning. Their carefully constructed narrative about their successful lives suddenly complicated by the sister they dismissed as irrelevant. I don't understand, Diana said finally. If you're some kind of secret agent, why are you living in that tiny apartment in Tucson? Why don't you have money? Director Wells answered before I could. Agent Martinez has been undercover for most of her career. Maintaining a low profile was essential to her operational effectiveness. The government has been depositing her salary and bonuses into secured accounts that she couldn't access without compromising her cover. How much money? Carlos asked. His real estate developer brain immediately focused on the financial implications. The director smiled coldly. Enough that Agent Martinez will never need to worry about her son's college tuition, or anything else, for that matter. Around us, the other funeral guests were slowly processing what they'd witnessed. Neighbors who'd known me as a child were looking at me like I'd transformed into someone completely different. Father Rodriguez approached hesitantly, his face full of wonder and confusion. "Sophia, is this true? You work for the CIA?" I nodded, unable to find words. After 15 years of lies and misdirection, the truth felt strange on my tongue. All those times. "You disappeared," Mrs. Gonzalez said from across the room. "We thought you were in trouble with drugs or men or something." "I was in trouble," I said quietly, "just not the kind you were thinking." Director Wells checked her watch with the efficiency of someone whose time was measured in national security briefings. "Agent Martinez, we need to discuss your next assignment, but first," she looked around the room meaningfully, "we need to have a conversation about operational security going forward." The implication was clear. Everyone in this room now knew classified information. Everyone in this room was now potentially at risk. "What does that mean?" Deanna asked, her voice tight with fear. "It means," the director said calmly, "that you're all going to sign some very comprehensive non-disclosure agreements, and it means that Agent Martinez's cover is permanently blown, which necessitates some significant changes to her operational status." She turned back to me, and I could see decisions being made behind her eyes. "Congratulations, Agent Martinez, you've just been promoted to Senior Operations Supervisor. Your new assignment is training the next generation of operatives at Quantico, full pension benefits, housing allowance, and Miguel will have access to the best schools in Virginia." Miguel looked up at me with eyes full of hope and excitement. "We're moving to Virginia? If you want to," I said. "Would you like that?" He grinned, and for the first time in months, he looked like the carefree kid I remembered from before his grandfather got sick. "Can I finally tell people what my mom really does for a living?" Director Wells laughed, a sound I'd never heard from her in all our years of working together. "Within limits." "Young man, within limits." Carlos cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable and uncertain. "So what happens now? Do we pretend this never happened?" "No," the director said. "You acknowledge that your sister has spent the last 15 years serving her country with distinction. You recognize that she has sacrificed more than most people sacrifice in a lifetime. And you treat her with the respect she deserves." Deanna set down her wineglass with trembling hands. "I feel sick. All this time, we thought we said such horrible things." "You said what you believed based on the information you had," I said quietly. "That's not your fault. But it was their fault, at least partially. They'd never given me the benefit of the doubt. They'd never asked if there might be more to my story than what appeared on the surface. They'd been content to write me off as a failure because it made their own success feel more meaningful by comparison." Director Wells began packing her briefcase, her official business apparently concluded. "Agent Martinez, report to Langley next Monday for your transition briefing. We'll discuss housing options and Miguel's school placement at that time." She paused at the door and looked back at the room full of stunned faces. "One more thing. Robert Martinez contacted us last year specifically to ask that we take care of his daughter when her active service ended. He said he knew she'd never ask for help herself, but he wanted to make sure she had options when she was ready to come home." She nodded once to the room and walked out, her security detail falling into step behind her like synchronized shadows. The silence stretched for several long minutes after they left. I stood in the middle of the church hall with my son beside me and a presidential medal around my neck, surrounded by family members who were seeing me clearly for the first time in 15 years. Mrs. Vasquez was the first to speak. "Mija, can you tell us anything about what you've done? Any stories?" I looked around at the faces of my childhood community, these people who'd known me before I became Agent Martinez, before I learned to kill with my bare hands and speak languages they'd never heard of and disappear into crowds in foreign countries. I can tell you that every time I was away, every time I missed Christmas dinner or Miguel's school play or Dad's birthday party, I was working to keep all of you safe. I was working to make sure that the world you live in, this peaceful little corner of Phoenix where the biggest worry is whether Mrs. Rodriguez's dog is going to dig up your garden again, could continue to exist. Miguel squeezed my hand tighter. Were you scared, Mom? Sometimes, I admitted. But fear is just information. It tells you to be careful, to be smart, to stay alive so you can come home to the people who matter. Carlos stood up slowly, his face pale with what I recognized as shame. Sophia, I owe you an apology. We all do. You don't owe me anything. Yes, we do. Diana's voice was thick with tears. We've treated you like garbage for years. We made you feel unwelcome at your own father's funeral, and you were out there risking your life to protect people like us. I looked at my siblings, these people who'd shared my childhood but had never really known me as an adult. The anger I'd carried for so long felt heavy and useless now, like armor I no longer needed. The past is the past, I said. What matters is what we do going forward. Diana wiped her eyes with a napkin, smearing her expensive makeup. What can we do? How do we make this right? You can let Miguel and me be part of this family again. You can stop treating me like an embarrassment, and start treating me like your sister. Carlos nodded quickly. Done. Absolutely. And Sophia, if you need anything for the move to Virginia, anything at all, just ask. I smiled for the first time since entering the church that morning. Actually, there is something you can do. Anything? Help me pack up Dad's house. There are things I want Miguel to have, memories I want him to understand about his grandfather. And I want to hear your stories too, the ones about Dad that I missed while I was gone. Diana stood up and walked around the table toward me. When she reached me, she stopped and looked directly into my eyes. I'm proud of you, Sophia. I'm proud to be your sister. She hugged me then, and it felt different from any embrace we'd shared as children. It felt like recognition, like acceptance, like the beginning of something new. Around us, the neighbors and family friends were beginning to clean up the reception, stacking plates and folding tablecloths with the practiced efficiency of people who'd hosted many church gatherings. But they moved quietly, respectfully, like they understood they'd witnessed something significant. Father Rodriguez approached as we were preparing to leave. Sophia, would you be willing to speak to our youth group sometime? When you're settled in Virginia, I think they could benefit from hearing about service and sacrifice from someone who's lived it. I looked at Miguel, who nodded eagerly. I'd like that, Father. I'd like that very much. As we walked out of St. Anthony's Church Hall for the last time, Miguel asked the question I'd been dreading. Mom, what was the scariest thing that ever happened to you on a mission? I thought about Beirut, about the 3 days I'd spent in a safe house while the city burned around me. I thought about the operation in Prague where I'd had to kill 2 men to prevent a bombing that would have leveled half the city center. I thought about the time in Moscow when I'd been captured and interrogated for 18 hours before managing to escape. But none of those things had scared me as much as walking into my father's funeral and feeling like a stranger in my own family. The scariest thing, I told him, was thinking that I'd have to choose between serving my country and being your mother. Thinking that I couldn't do both well. Miguel considered this as we walked toward our car, but you did do both well. You saved a lot of people, and you raised me right. I ruffled his hair, this kid who'd grown up thinking his mother was a failure but had loved me anyway. You're pretty wise for 15, I learned from the best. As we drove away from the church, I looked in the rearview mirror at Diana and Carlos helping Mom into Diana's Mercedes. My family looked smaller somehow, diminished by the revelation that the daughter they'd dismissed had actually been living a life of significance they couldn't begin to comprehend. But they also looked different. Humbled, maybe, ready to rebuild relationships they'd neglected for too long. Miguel stared out the passenger window at the desert landscape flowing past. Mom, when we move to Virginia, will I be able to visit Phoenix sometimes? Will I get to see Grandma and Aunt Diana, and Uncle Carlos? Of course, Miguel, they're your family too. He nodded thoughtfully. Good, I think they need to get to know me better, and I want to learn more about Grandpa, about who he really was. I reached over and squeezed his hand. He was proud of you too, Miguel, even though he didn't get to spend much time with you. He was proud to be your grandfather. We drove through the familiar streets of my childhood one more time, past the house where I'd learned to ride a bike, past the school where I'd discovered I was good with languages, past the library where I'd first read about far-off places I'd dreamed of seeing someday. I had seen those places, and many more besides. I'd walked through the streets of foreign cities and spoken languages my high school teachers had never heard of. I'd done things that mattered, things that made a difference in ways both large and small. But the most important thing I'd ever done was sitting beside me, asking thoughtful questions about our new life and trusting me to guide him through the changes ahead. Agent Martinez was getting a new assignment, a new life, a new chance to serve her country in a different way. But Sofia Martinez, the girl from Phoenix who'd always wanted to make the world a better place, was finally coming home. The next morning arrived with the kind of Arizona sunrise that painted the mountains purple and gold, the desert coming alive in shades I'd forgotten existed during my years in concrete safe houses and urban operations centers. Miguel was already awake when I opened my eyes, sitting cross-legged on the air mattress with Dad's old photo albums spread around him like treasure maps. "I found these in the closet," he said without looking up. "Grandpa kept everything." I sat up in my childhood bed and watched my son discover pieces of a family history he'd never been allowed to know. There were pictures of me at every age, from gap-toothed first grader to high school valedictorian, carefully preserved behind plastic sheets that Dad had probably arranged himself. Miguel held up a photo of me at age 8, missing my 2 front teeth and grinning beside a science fair trophy. "You were really smart, weren't you, Mom?" I was curious about everything. "Still am, I suppose." He flipped through more pages, studying pictures of family barbecues and birthday parties and Christmas mornings, all the normal moments that had made up my life before it became classified. There was a photo of Diana teaching me to braid friendship bracelets, another of Carlos showing me how to throw a curveball in the backyard. We'd been a real family once before success and disappointment and years of misunderstanding had created distance between us. "Look at this one," Miguel said, holding up a picture I hadn't seen in 20 years. It showed me at my high school graduation party, surrounded by friends and family in our backyard. Dad stood behind me with his hand on my shoulder, his face beaming with pride. Mom was beside him, and even Diana and Carlos looked genuinely happy for me. Everyone believed I was headed for college, then maybe graduate school, then a respectable career that would make the Martinez family proud. None of us could have imagined that within 6 months I'd be learning hand-to-hand combat at a classified facility in Virginia. "Did you always want to be a spy?" Miguel asked. I laughed, the question striking me as both innocent and profound. "Nobody grows up wanting to be a spy, Mijo. It's not like wanting to be a doctor or a teacher. The CIA finds you usually when you're young and talented and maybe a little lost." "How did they find you?" I pulled on a robe and walked to the window, looking out at the neighborhood where I'd learned to ride bikes and play hide-and-seek and dream about the future. Mrs. Vasquez was already up, sweeping her front walk with the dedication of someone who'd been fighting desert dust for decades. I was a sophomore at Arizona State, double majoring in international relations and linguistics. I could already speak Spanish and French fluently, and I was picking up Arabic pretty quickly. One day this professor asked me to stay after class, said there were people who might be interested in my skill set. What kind of people? The kind who noticed when a 19-year-old could translate diplomatic documents from 4 different languages without using a dictionary. Miguel absorbed this information with the seriousness of someone trying to understand how his entire worldview had been wrong. "Did you want to go?" I thought about those early days, the excitement and terror of being recruited for something I didn't fully understand. The CIA had offered me purpose, adventure, and the chance to serve something bigger than myself. At 19, fresh out of Phoenix and hungry for significance, it had felt like winning the lottery. I wanted to matter, I said finally. I wanted to do something that would make a difference in the world. And you did. I did. But I also lost a lot. I lost 15 years with my family. I lost the chance to be honest with the people I loved. I lost the ability to have normal relationships, normal conversations, a normal life. Miguel closed the photo album and looked at me with eyes that seemed far older than 15. Was it worth it? The question hung in the morning air between us. Was it worth it? All the missions? All the sacrifices? All the nights I'd lain awake, wondering if my son would be better off with a mother who was actually present in his life, instead of disappearing at a moment's notice to prevent disasters he'd never know about. Ask me again in 10 years, I said, when you're old enough to understand what the world looks like, without people willing to stand in the shadows and do the difficult things. From the kitchen came the sound of Mom making coffee, the same morning routine she'd followed for 40 years. Soon Diana and Carlos would be up, and we'd all sit around the breakfast table like a normal family, except nothing was normal anymore. Everything had changed yesterday when Director Wells walked into that church hall. Miguel began carefully stacking the photo albums. Mom, can I ask you something? Always. Are you glad it's over? The secret stuff? I considered the question while watching Mrs. Vasquez water her desert roses, the same flowers she'd been tending since I was Miguel's age. Yesterday I'd been Agent Martinez, living a carefully constructed lie to protect everyone around me. Today I was Sofia Martinez again. Free to be honest for the first time in 15 years, part of me is relieved, I admitted. It's exhausting, living two different lives. Always having to remember which story I'm supposed to tell, always being careful not to let anything slip. But part of you isn't? Part of me is terrified, I said honestly. Being Agent Martinez gave me purpose, importance. I knew exactly who I was and what I was supposed to do. Being Sofia Martinez again means figuring out who I am when I'm not saving the world. Miguel grinned and I saw my father's smile in his face. Maybe you can just be my mom. That seems pretty important to me. The simple truth of it hit me like a physical blow. For 15 years, I'd convinced myself that my work was more important than my personal life, that sacrificing time with Miguel was justified by the lives I was saving half a world away. But what if the most important job I'd ever had was the one I'd been doing all along, just not very well because I'd been distracted by everything else? Diana appeared in the doorway, already dressed and made up despite the early hour. She looked uncomfortable, like she was entering a room where she wasn't sure she belonged. Sofia, can we talk? Privately? Miguel took the hint and gathered up the photo albums. I'm going to show these to Grandma. She probably has stories to go with all the pictures. After he left, Diana perched on the edge of my childhood desk chair, her posture stiff and formal. She'd always carried herself like someone who was perpetually being evaluated, probably because in her corporate world, she was. I don't know how to do this, she said finally. Do what? Be your sister, the real you. I mean, I've spent so many years thinking of you as the family screw-up that I don't know how to think of you as someone who's accomplished more than Carlos and I put together. I pulled my knees up to my chest, suddenly feeling like the little sister again despite everything that had happened. You don't have to think of me any differently. I'm still the same person. No, you're not. You're someone who speaks 4 languages and has medals from the president, and has lived through things I can't even imagine. You're someone who's been protecting people like me while I've been complaining about quarterly earnings reports and client meetings. The self-recrimination in her voice was painful to hear. Diana had always been hard on herself, always pushing to achieve more, to climb higher, to prove her worth through external validation. It was one of the things we'd had in common, though I'd never recognized it before. Your work matters too, I said. You employ people, you contribute to the economy, you've built something significant. Diana laughed bitterly. I sell financial services to rich people who want to get richer. You prevented terrorist attacks. Both things can matter. Not everyone needs to be a spy. She was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the neighborhood where we'd grown up together. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller, more vulnerable than I'd heard it since we were children. I've been jealous of you for years. That caught me off guard. Jealous? Of what? Of how much Dad loved you. Even when he was disappointed, even when he didn't understand your choices, you were still his favorite. You were the smart one, the one with potential. Carlos and I were just the ones who did what was expected. I stared at my sister, this successful woman who'd climbed corporate ladders and married well and lived the kind of life our parents had dreamed their children would have. The idea that she'd envied me, the supposed family failure, was almost incomprehensible. Diana, you've achieved everything you set out to achieve. You have the house, the husband, the career. You've made Mom and Dad proud in all the traditional ways, but I never made them proud the way you did. Even yesterday, when we found out the truth, I could see it in Mom's face. She was proud of you in a way she's never been proud of me. Before I could respond, Carlos appeared in the doorway, looking as uncomfortable as Diana had. He'd clearly been listening to at least part of our conversation. Can I join this awkward family therapy session? Diana managed a weak smile. The more the merrier. Carlos sat on the air mattress where Miguel had been sleeping, and suddenly we were arranged like we used to be as kids, gathered in my room to share secrets and complain about our parents and plan adventures we'd never actually undertake. I owe you an apology too, Carlos said without preamble. Maybe the biggest apology of all. For what? For being an ass yesterday. For treating you like the hired help at Dad's funeral. For years of making you feel like you didn't belong in this family. I appreciated the apology, but part of me wondered if it was genuine or just guilt talking. Carlos had always been practical above all else, quick to adapt his behavior to changing circumstances. Now that I was revealed to be successful rather than failed, was he simply recalibrating his treatment of me? It's fine, Carlos. You didn't know. That's not an excuse. He ran his hands through his hair, a nervous gesture I remembered from childhood. Even if you had been a failure, even if you had dropped out of college and been working dead-end jobs, you still deserve to be treated with respect. You're our sister. The simplicity of the statement hung between us. Family was supposed to be about unconditional love, about standing by each other regardless of success or failure, about creating safe spaces where people could be imperfect and still belong. We'd lost that somewhere along the way, probably when achievement became more important than connection. Diana cleared her throat. Sophia, can you tell us anything about what you've done? I know it's probably classified, but I considered what I could share without violating my oath or putting anyone in danger. There were stories that might help them understand what my life had been like without revealing operational details that could compromise ongoing missions. I can tell you that I've lived in 8 different countries. I've posed as everything from a graduate student to an art dealer to a diplomatic attaché. I've prevented 3 major terrorist attacks that would have killed hundreds of people, and helped disrupt weapons smuggling networks that were supplying conflicts in Africa and the Middle East. Carlos whistled low. Jesus, Sophia, how do you even process that kind of responsibility? Very carefully. And with a lot of therapy that I can't tell my therapist about. That got a laugh from both of them. The first genuine laughter we'd shared in years. What was the hardest part? Diana asked. Missing Miguel's childhood, I said without hesitation. Being gone for his first steps, his first words, his first day of school. Having to leave in the middle of parent-teacher conferences because something was happening in Syria or Afghanistan, or wherever. Knowing that he was growing up thinking his mother was unreliable when actually I was just trying to keep the world stable enough for him to grow up in. The room fell quiet again. Through the thin walls, we could hear Mom moving around the kitchen, probably starting breakfast for everyone. In a few hours, Diana and Carlos would drive back to their successful lives in Scottsdale and Tempe, and Miguel and I would begin packing for our move to Virginia. But for now, we were just siblings again, trying to figure out how to be a family after years of growing apart. There's something else I need to tell you both, I said. About the money. What money? Director Wells mentioned that I have accounts I haven't been able to access. Salary and bonuses from 15 years of service. It's more than I'll ever need. How much more? Carlos asked, his business instincts kicking in. Enough to pay off Mom's house. Enough to set up college funds for your kids, Diana. Enough to help with Carlos's next development project if he wants. Enough to take care of the whole family. Diana's eyes filled with tears. Sophia, you don't owe us anything. After the way we've treated you. You're my family, I said simply. This is what family does. We take care of each other. Carlos stood up abruptly and walked to the window, his back to us. I could see his shoulders shaking slightly. Carlos, I don't deserve a sister like you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. All these years you've been out there risking your life while I've been worried about property values and profit margins. And now you want to share your money with us. Not because you deserve it, I said gently. Because I love you. Because despite everything that's happened, despite all the misunderstandings and hurt feelings, you're my brother and sister and I want us to be a real family again. Diana crossed the room and hugged Carlos from behind, and then gestured for me to join them. We stood there in my childhood bedroom, three middle-aged siblings trying to repair relationships that had been damaged by years of assumptions and pride and failure to communicate. Miguel appeared in the doorway, took one look at us, and grinned. Are you guys having a moment? The biggest moment, Diana said, wiping her eyes. Can I be part of it? Miguel joined our awkward group hug, and for the first time in 15 years, I felt like I was truly home. Not just in the house where I'd grown up, but in the family that had shaped me before the world taught me to keep secrets, and live lies and sacrifice personal happiness for abstract concepts like national security. Mom called from the kitchen that breakfast was ready, and we trooped down the hallway like we used to when we were kids, arguing over who got the biggest pancakes and whether Diana was allowed to hog the orange juice. But as we gathered around the kitchen table, I realized that some things had changed permanently. Carlos pulled out my chair for me, a small gesture of respect he'd never shown before. Diana asked Miguel detailed questions about school and his interests, trying to make up for years of treating him like an afterthought. Mom kept looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, like she was seeing me clearly for the first time. After we'd finished eating, Diana pulled out her phone and began scrolling through her calendar. When do you have to report to Virginia? Monday. Director Wells wants to start my transition to the training position right away. That's only 5 days away. Do you need help packing? Moving? Miguel and I don't have much. We've always traveled light. Carlos leaned forward. What about Miguel's school? Has he been accepted anywhere in Virginia? Director Wells mentioned that he'd have access to good schools. I assume the CIA has resources for these kinds of transitions. Diana frowned. You shouldn't have to assume anything. This is your son's education we're talking about. Let me make some calls, do some research. I have contacts on the East Coast who might be able to help. The offer surprised me. Diana had never shown much interest in Miguel's welfare before, probably because she'd written me off as an irresponsible parent along with everything else. Now she was volunteering to help ensure his future. That would be great, I said. Thank you. What about housing? Carlos asked. Are they providing you with a place to live? The government will arrange something, I'm sure. Government housing might not be what Miguel needs, he said thoughtfully. Let me look into private rentals in the Quantico area. If you're going to have access to your back pay, you should be able to afford something nice. I looked around the table at these people who'd spent years treating me like an embarrassment and were now mobilizing to help with my transition to a new life. The transformation was almost too much to process. You don't have to do all this, I said. Yes, we do. Mom interjected quietly. We have 15 years of support to make up for. She reached across the table and took my hand, her fingers soft and familiar. I'm sorry, Misha. I'm sorry for all the times I doubted you, all the times I wished you were different. I should have known you were doing something important, even if I didn't understand what it was. The apology I'd been waiting for without realizing it. The validation from the woman who'd raised me, who'd taught me right from wrong, who'd watched me walk away from everything familiar without understanding why. You raised me to want to make a difference, Mama. Everything I've done, All the choices I've made, they came from values you and Dad taught me. Miguel looked around the table at his newly expanded family with satisfaction. So when we move to Virginia, you'll all come visit us. Try to keep us away, Diana said. I want to see where my sister trains the next generation of heroes, and I want to meet some of your colleagues. Carlos added. I've never known anyone who worked for the CIA. I laughed, imagining my real estate developer brother trying to network with intelligence operatives. It might not be as exciting as you think. A lot of paperwork and briefings and bureaucratic meetings. Still sounds more interesting than zoning permits and construction. Contracts. We spent the rest of the morning going through Dad's belongings, deciding what to keep and what to donate. Miguel claimed Dad's toolbox and his collection of baseball caps, tangible connections to the grandfather he was just beginning to understand. Diana found the jewelry box Dad had made for Mom in his high school shop class, and Carlos discovered a stack of letters Dad had written to Mom during his brief stint in the army, before they were married. In the bottom drawer of Dad's dresser, wrapped in an old t-shirt, Mom found something that made her gasp. It was a newspaper clipping from the Arizona Republic, dated 6 months ago. The headline read, "Local woman honored for government service," with a small photo of me at what looked like an official ceremony. Where did this come from? I asked, studying the picture. I'd never seen this article before. Mrs. Vasquez brought it over, Mom said. She said she found it online and thought your father would want to see it. He kept it hidden because he didn't want to embarrass you if it was supposed to be secret. The article was vague, mentioning only that I'd received recognition for exceptional service in support of national security objectives. Someone at the agency must have planted it as part of maintaining my cover, creating a plausible explanation for any honors or commendations that might leak into public records. But Dad had seen it. Dad had known that his daughter was being honored by the government, even if he didn't understand exactly why. He'd kept the secret of my service and the secret of my recognition, protecting me even from his own pride. He knew, Miguel said softly. Grandpa knew you were a hero. Heroes don't exist, I told him, repeating something my first training officer had said to me 20 years ago. There are just people who do their jobs, even when those jobs are difficult or dangerous or require sacrifice. Diana stood up from where she'd been sorting through Dad's papers. Well, if heroes don't exist, then what do we call people who spend 15 years protecting strangers while their own families think they're failures? I considered the question while looking around my childhood bedroom, now stripped of most of Dad's belongings, but still full of memories of the girl I'd been before the world became complicated. What did we call people like me? What did we call people who chose service over recognition, duty over comfort, the greater good over personal happiness? We call them Americans, I said finally. We call them people who understood that freedom isn't free, that democracy requires maintenance, that peace is something you have to fight for, not something you can take for granted. Miguel hugged me then, this wonderful boy who was finally beginning to understand why his mother had always seemed a little distant, a little distracted, a little different from other parents. I'm proud of you, Mom. I'm proud to be Agent Martinez's son. For the first time in 15 years, I was proud of that too. 6 months later, I stood in front of a classroom at the CIA training facility in Quantico, watching 25 eager young faces absorb their first lesson in operational security. They looked impossibly young to me now, these college graduates who thought they understood what service meant, who believed they were ready to sacrifice everything for their country without truly comprehending what everything entailed. Agent Rodriguez, please explain the primary rule of deep cover operations, I said to a earnest-looking woman in the front row. Never break character, even when you're alone, she replied confidently. Incorrect. I walked across the front of the classroom, letting the silence stretch until I could see doubt creeping into their expressions. The primary rule is never forget who you really are underneath the character. The moment you lose yourself in the role, you become a liability to everyone depending on you. I clicked to the next slide in my presentation, a photograph of a family barbecue that could have been taken in any backyard in America. It showed me at age 10, grinning beside Dad as he flipped burgers on our ancient grill, Diana and Carlos arguing over something trivial in the background, Mom arranging paper plates on our picnic table. "This is my family," I told the class. For 15 years, they thought I was a failure, because that's what my cover required them to believe. I missed birthdays, graduations, holidays, and family emergencies because the mission came first. I watched my son grow up thinking his mother was unreliable, watched my siblings dismiss me as the family disappointment, watched my parents worry about my future, while I was preventing disasters they'd never hear about. Agent Thompson, a cocky kid from Yale who reminded me uncomfortably of my younger self, raised his hand. But that was the job, right? Personal sacrifice for the greater good. I studied him for a moment, recognizing the idealistic fervor that had driven me to accept recruitment at 19. "Was your sacrifice worth it, Agent Martinez?" he pressed. The question hung in the classroom air like smoke. Was it worth it? The same question Miguel had asked me in Dad's house, the same question I'd been asking myself every day since Director Wells walked into that church hall. Ask the families who didn't lose loved ones in the 3 terrorist attacks we prevented. Ask the children in Syrian refugee camps who received aid because we disrupted the weapons networks financing civil war. Ask the American diplomats who came home safely because we gathered intelligence that protected their missions. I advanced to the next slide, a world map dotted with red pins, marking every location where I'd operated over the past 15 years. Beirut, Prague, Moscow, Tehran, Kabul, Lagos, Caracas, Jakarta, cities that had become chapters in a story I could never fully tell. But also ask my son, who spent his childhood thinking his mother didn't love him enough to stay. Ask my father, who died believing his daughter had wasted her potential. Ask my family, who grieved for the woman they thought I'd become, while never knowing the woman I actually was. The classroom had grown completely quiet. These young recruits had signed up for adventure and importance, for the chance to serve something greater than themselves. None of them had considered the possibility that the greatest sacrifice might not be risking their lives in foreign countries, but losing themselves in the process. The point, I continued, is not that the sacrifice isn't worth making. The point is that you need to understand what you're sacrificing before you make that choice. You need to decide what parts of yourself you're willing to lose, and what parts you'll fight to keep. Agent Rodriguez raised her hand tentatively. "How do you know which parts to keep?" I thought about Miguel, now thriving at his new school in Virginia, finally able to tell his friends that his mother worked for the government without having to lie about the details. I thought about Diana, who called every Sunday to check on us and had visited twice since our move. I thought about Carlos, who'd helped us find and furnish our house, who'd spent an entire weekend teaching Miguel how to throw a proper spiral in our backyard. You keep the parts that remind you why you're doing this work in the first place. You keep the connections that anchor you to the world you're trying to protect. You keep the relationships that make you human, even when the job requires you to be something else. My phone buzzed with a text message. Miguel letting me know his soccer practice was running late, that he'd catch a ride home with his teammate's mom, that he'd see me at dinner. Normal teenager stuff, the kind of mundane communication that had once seemed impossible in my compartmentalized world. The transformation hadn't been easy, moving to Virginia, establishing new routines, learning to be present for Miguel's daily life after years of sporadic availability. There were nights when I woke up reaching for weapons that weren't there, mornings when I checked for surveillance that didn't exist, moments when civilian life felt more dangerous than any undercover operation. But there were also Sunday dinners with extended family who now knew the truth about my service. There were parent-teacher conferences I could attend without worrying about blown cover. There were conversations with Miguel about his future that didn't require me to lie about my own past. Agent Santos, a serious young man from Texas, raised his hand. What if you have to choose between the mission and your family? Then you choose the mission, I said without hesitation, every time. That's what you signed up for. That's what the oath means. But you also make sure your family understands why you made that choice, even if you can't tell them the details. I thought about the letter I'd written to Miguel when he was 5 years old, sealed in an envelope marked to be opened only if something happens to me. It explained everything I couldn't tell him while I was alive. Every mission and choice and sacrifice. I'd updated it regularly over the years, adding new operations, new dangers, new apologies for all the moments I'd missed. He'd never had to open that letter, thank God. But knowing it existed had helped me sleep at night during the most dangerous assignments, knowing that someday he'd understand the woman his mother had really been. The classroom discussion continued for another hour, these young agents grappling with concepts they thought they understood, but were only beginning to confront. I remembered my own first day at Quantico, remembered the instructor who'd tried to prepare us for the psychological cost of long-term undercover work. I'd thought I was different, stronger, better equipped to handle the isolation and deception than the other recruits. I'd been wrong, of course. Nobody was equipped for it. You just learn to endure it, day by day, mission by mission, until endurance became a habit and habits became identity. After class, I walked across the campus toward the administrative building where Director Wells maintained her Virginia office. She'd requested a progress report on the training program, but I suspected she also wanted to check on my adjustment to civilian instructorship. Patricia Wells had been managing intelligence officers for 3 decades. She knew the signs of someone struggling with the transition from active service to support roles. Her assistant waved me into the inner office, where the director sat behind a desk that looked like mission control for a small war. Multiple screens displayed real-time intelligence feeds from around the world, encrypted communications from field agents, threat assessments that would determine tomorrow's headlines. The scope of information flowing through this room was staggering, representing thousands of intelligence professionals working in locations I'd never know about. Agent Martinez, she said without looking up from a classified briefing folder, how are our new recruits progressing? They're idealistic, ambitious, and completely unprepared for what this work actually costs, I replied, settling into the chair across from her desk. So, exactly like we were at their age. Director Wells smiled, finally closing the folder and giving me her full attention. Any regrets about leaving active service? The question was both professional and personal, coming from someone who'd made similar choices at various points in her own career. Patricia Wells had been a field agent before she became an administrator, had sacrificed relationships and personal happiness for national security objectives, had wrestled with the same questions about service and cost that haunted everyone in our profession. I thought about it for a moment, looking out the window at the training grounds where new agents were learning to shoot, to fight, to lie convincingly under pressure. Part of me missed the adrenaline, the sense of immediate importance, the knowledge that my actions were directly preventing catastrophes. But I also thought about last weekend, when Miguel had asked me to help with a history project about the Cold War. For the first time, I'd been able to share real insights about international relations, to explain the context behind events he was studying without worrying about revealing classified information. We'd spent 3 hours at the kitchen table, working together on something that mattered to him, and I'd been completely present for every moment. No regrets, I said. This is exactly where I need to be right now. Good. Because I have something to discuss with you. She opened another folder, this one marked with security classifications I hadn't seen in years. We're developing a new program, a joint initiative with Allied Intelligence Services. We need someone to design the training curriculum, someone who understands both the operational requirements and the human costs. What kind of program? Deep cover specialists, agents who can maintain false identities for years, even decades, while gathering intelligence on emerging threats. It's the kind of work you excelled at, but with even longer commitments and deeper isolation. I felt a familiar flutter of excitement, the old hunger for missions that mattered, for work that required everything I had to give. But I also thought about Miguel's soccer games, about Diana's Sunday phone calls, about the promise I'd made to myself and my family to be present for the life we were building together. How long would the design phase take? 6 months, maybe 8. Mostly research and planning, some consultation with international partners, all of it based here in Virginia, no travel required. You'd be creating the framework that will prepare agents for assignments you'll never have to take yourself. The perfect compromise, meaningful work that drew on my experience without requiring me to sacrifice the relationships I'd fought to rebuild. I could design training programs that might prevent other agents from making some of the mistakes I'd made, help them navigate the psychological challenges I'd learned to handle through trial and error. I'm interested, I said. When would you need an answer? Director Wells smiled. I'll take that as a yes. Your first briefing is scheduled for Monday morning. As I walked back across campus toward the parking garage, I called Miguel to let him know I'd be home in time for dinner. He answered on the second ring, his voice animated as he told me about his day, about the soccer practice that had gone well, about the girl in his chemistry class who'd asked him to study together for their upcoming exam. Normal teenage concerns, the kind of problems every 15-year-old should be worried about. No anxiety about whether his mother would disappear suddenly, no questions about why she couldn't discuss her work, no sense that his life was somehow different or more precarious than his friends' lives. On the drive home, I took a slight detour through the neighborhood where we'd lived when Miguel was small, before my work required us to move so frequently. The house looked exactly the same, still painted the soft blue color Miguel had chosen when he was 8 years old. A different family lived there now, probably with their own complications and secrets and challenges. But for 2 years, it had been our sanctuary. Miguel had played in that backyard, had friends over for birthday parties, had attended the elementary school 3 blocks away, without ever having to explain why his mother traveled so much for work. We'd been as close to normal as my career had ever allowed. Our current house was bigger, more permanent, the kind of place where a teenager could establish roots and imagine bringing college friends home for holidays. Miguel's room was twice the size of any bedroom he'd ever had, with space for the desk Diana had bought him, and the bookcases Carlos had installed. Photo albums from our Phoenix trip were displayed on his dresser, pictures of him with grandparents and aunts and uncles, who finally knew the truth about our family. I pulled into our driveway just as Miguel emerged from the backyard, grass stains on his jeans and his hair sticking up in all directions. He grinned when he saw me, the same unself-conscious smile he'd had as a little boy, before the world taught him to be cautious about expressing joy. "How was work today?" he asked, falling into step beside me as we walked toward the house. "Challenging. I'm starting a new project next week." Miguel nodded, accepting this information without pressing for details he knew I couldn't share. The boundaries of my work were clearer now, less mysterious than they'd been when my entire career was classified. He understood that some aspects of intelligence work would always be secret, but he also knew that the broad outlines of my life were finally transparent. Inside, I found a package on the kitchen counter, addressed to me in Diana's careful handwriting. Miguel watched curiously as I opened it, revealing a framed photograph I'd never seen before. It showed our entire extended family at Miguel's soccer game from last month, when Diana and Carlos had driven down from Phoenix to visit. Miguel was in the center of the photo in his team uniform, surrounded by his grandmother, his aunt and uncle, and me. Everyone was smiling. Everyone looked relaxed and happy. Everyone appeared to belong exactly where they were. There was a note tucked behind the photograph. "For Sophia's office at Quantico, every hero needs a reminder of what they're fighting for." Love, Diana. Miguel read the note over my shoulder and grinned. Aunt Diana's getting sentimental in her old age. I studied the photograph, this evidence of the family we'd somehow managed to rebuild after years of distance and misunderstanding. We looked like people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company, who had overcome significant obstacles to create something meaningful together. Heroes don't exist. I'd told my students that morning. There are just people who do their jobs, even when those jobs require sacrifice. But looking at this picture, I realized I'd been wrong. Heroes did exist. They were teachers who stayed late to help struggling students. They were nurses who worked double shifts during emergencies. They were single parents who found ways to be present for their children despite impossible circumstances. They were family members who chose forgiveness over resentment, understanding over judgment, love over pride. They were people who showed up, day after day, for the work that mattered most, whether that work involved preventing terrorist attacks, or raising children, or rebuilding relationships, whether it took place in foreign capitals, or suburban classrooms, or church halls in Phoenix. Miguel helped me find the perfect spot for the photograph on my bookshelf, next to my intelligence star, and a ceramic mug he'd made me in art class. The three objects looked strange together, representing different aspects of a life that had finally learned to integrate service and family, duty and love, the woman I'd needed to become, and the woman I'd always been. That evening, as we sat around our dining room table sharing pizza and stories from our respective days, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a familiar Phoenix number. It was Mom, calling to tell us about her day, about the new flowers she'd planted in Dad's memory garden, about Mrs. Vasquez's latest neighborhood gossip. She asked about Miguel's schoolwork and my training program, inquired about our weekend plans, reminded us that Carlos was planning another visit next month. Normal family conversation, the kind of easy connection I'd thought was lost forever when I walked away from Phoenix 15 years ago, but families, I'd learned, were more resilient than they appeared. Love could survive years of misunderstanding if people were willing to do the work of rebuilding trust and creating new patterns of connection. After Miguel went upstairs to finish his homework, I sat in our living room with my laptop, reviewing the classified files Director Wells had given me for the new training program. The scope of the project was ambitious, requiring me to synthesize everything I'd learned about long-term undercover work into a curriculum that would prepare agents for assignments even more demanding than mine had been. It was exactly the kind of challenge I'd craved during my active service years, meaningful work that drew on my expertise while contributing to something larger than any individual mission. But it was also work I could do from home, work that wouldn't require me to disappear for weeks or months, work that allowed me to be present for Miguel's remaining high school years. The balance I'd spent 15 years trying to achieve was finally within reach. Not perfect balance, because perfect didn't exist in careers that dealt with life and death consequences, but sustainable balance, the kind that acknowledged competing priorities while refusing to sacrifice everything for any single commitment. Miguel appeared in the living room doorway, pajamas on and homework completed. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Always," I said, closing the laptop to give him my full attention. "Do you think Grandpa would be proud of how everything turned out?" I considered the question, thinking about Dad's secret pride in my service, his quiet support for choices he didn't fully understand, his final message through Mrs. Vasquez that he'd always known I was doing important work. "I think he'd be proud that we found our way back to each other. I think he'd be proud that you're growing up to be a good man who cares about his family and his community, and I think he'd be proud that we learned how to be honest with the people we love, even when the truth is complicated." Miguel nodded thoughtfully. I miss him too, but he's still with us in all the ways that matter, in the values he taught us, in the love he showed us, in the family he brought together." After Miguel went to bed, I returned to my work on the training curriculum, but my mind kept drifting to larger questions about service and sacrifice, about the costs we're willing to pay for the work we believe matters most. I thought about the young agents I was training, These idealistic recruits who were about to embark on careers that would test every assumption they had about themselves and their capabilities. I thought about my own journey from small-town girl to CIA operative to instructor, about all the mistakes and victories and hard-earned wisdom that had brought me to this moment. I thought about Miguel, asleep upstairs in the permanent bedroom he'd never had before, secure in the knowledge that his mother would be there in the morning and every morning after that. I thought about my siblings in Phoenix, working to rebuild relationships they'd thought were permanently damaged, learning that families could heal from years of misunderstanding if everyone was willing to do the work. And I thought about Dad, who'd understood more than any of us had realized, who'd been proud of his daughter's service even when he couldn't fully comprehend what that service entailed, who'd loved us all despite our failures and mistakes and inability to communicate the things that mattered most. The work I was designing would prepare agents for assignments that required them to sacrifice personal relationships for national security objectives. But it would also teach them how to hold on to the core of who they were, how to maintain connections that reminded them why their sacrifice was worthwhile, how to find their way back to the people and values that gave their work meaning, because service without love was just ambition, duty without connection was just obligation. The work only mattered if it protected something worth protecting, and the things most worth protecting were often the relationships we thought we had to sacrifice to do the work properly. I'd learned that lesson the hard way, through 15 years of separation and secrecy and missed opportunities for connection, but I'd learned it eventually, and perhaps that hard-earned wisdom could help the next generation of agents navigate the challenges more successfully than I had. Outside our house, the Virginia suburbs were quiet and peaceful, protected by thousands of men and women whose names would never appear in history books, whose sacrifices would never be publicly acknowledged, whose work made possible the ordinary evening I was enjoying with my son. Some of them were probably sitting in safe houses on the other side of the world, missing their own children's bedtime routines, making the kinds of sacrifices I'd made for so many years. They were doing essential work, work that mattered, work that required everything they had to give, but they were also people who would someday need to find their way back to the lives they'd left behind, to the relationships they'd protected by keeping their distance, to the families who'd never fully understood what they'd been doing while they were gone. That was the work I was meant to do now. Not preventing disasters in foreign countries, but helping the people who prevented those disasters find their way home when the mission was complete. Teaching them that service and love weren't mutually exclusive, that the greatest victories often happen not on battlefields or in embassy backrooms, but around kitchen tables where families chose forgiveness over resentment, understanding over judgment, connection over pride. It was different work than I'd done before, but it was no less important, because at the end of the day, we weren't protecting abstract concepts like democracy or freedom. We were protecting the ability of families to sit around their dinner tables and argue about homework and share stories and plan for futures they believed were possible. We were protecting the right of children to grow up thinking their biggest problems were chemistry tests and soccer tryouts, and whether the girl in their class liked them back. We were protecting the possibility that love could survive misunderstanding, that families could heal from years of separation, that people could find their way back to each other even when the path seemed impossible to navigate. Miguel's light was still on upstairs, probably reading one more chapter before sleep. In Phoenix, Mom was watching her evening news programs, perhaps thinking about the son-in-law and grandson she'd finally gotten to know. Diana was probably reviewing quarterly reports in her Scottsdale home office, taking breaks to text me random thoughts about Miguel's upcoming school events she wanted to attend. Carlos was somewhere reviewing construction plans, making mental notes about projects Miguel might find interesting when he visited this summer. All of us connected now, in ways that had seemed impossible just 6 months ago, before Director Wells walked into that church hall, and changed everything with a simple question. I'm looking for Agent Martinez. I'd spent 15 years being Agent Martinez, sacrificing personal relationships for professional obligations, believing that service required me to choose between love and duty. But I'd learned that the best agents weren't the ones who abandoned their humanity for the mission. They were the ones who fought to maintain their connections to the world they were protecting, who remembered why the work mattered, who found ways to serve their country without losing their souls. Tomorrow, I would stand in front of another classroom full of eager young agents and try to teach them lessons I was still learning myself. I would help them understand that the greatest challenge wasn't surviving hostile foreign environments or maintaining complex cover stories, it was finding their way back to themselves and the people they loved when the mission was over. It was learning that heroes weren't people who sacrificed everything for abstract principles. They were people who figured out how to serve something greater than themselves without losing the relationships that made life worth living in the first place. Outside, Virginia slept peacefully under the protection of people whose names no one would ever know. Inside our house, Miguel finished his reading and turned off his light, secure in the knowledge that his mother would be there in the morning. And in her home office, Agent Martinez closed her laptop and prepared for another day of teaching the next generation of intelligence officers how to save the world without losing themselves in the process. The mission continued, but now it included coming home. 2 years had passed since that transformative day at Dad's funeral, and I stood in the graduation ceremony auditorium at Quantico, watching my latest class of trainees receive their assignments. These weren't the same eager faces I'd started with 18 months ago. The intensive program had carved away their naive assumptions about intelligence work, replacing youthful idealism with hard-earned wisdom about the true cost of serving in the shadows. Agent Jennifer Park stepped forward to receive her assignment envelope, her posture reflecting the confidence that came from surviving psychological evaluations, combat training, and months of learning to live convincingly as someone else. She'd been one of my most challenging students, brilliant but headstrong, reminding me uncomfortably of the young woman I'd been when I first arrived at this same facility 20 years ago. Park had questioned everything, pushed back against protocols, argued that family connections made agents stronger rather than more vulnerable. She'd written her final thesis on maintaining psychological health during long-term undercover assignments, citing research I'd helped develop about the importance of authentic relationships in preventing the identity fractures that ended too many promising careers. Now she was headed to Berlin, where she'd spend the next 3 years posing as a graduate student while monitoring emerging threats from Eastern European criminal organizations. It was exactly the kind of assignment I'd thrived on at her age, complex enough to be intellectually engaging but structured enough to allow for regular contact with her support network. After the ceremony concluded and the new agents scattered to celebrate their achievements before reporting to their first postings, I found myself alone in my office, reviewing the psychological profiles of candidates for next year's program. The work had evolved significantly since I'd taken over the training division. We now spent as much time preparing agents for reintegration as we did teaching them to disappear into their covers. Director Wells appeared in my doorway without knocking, a habit she'd maintained from our operational days when formal courtesies could waste precious seconds during crisis situations. She looked older than she had 2 years ago, the weight of managing global intelligence operations carving new lines around her eyes, but her presence still commanded immediate attention from everyone in her vicinity. "Impressive graduation rate this year," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. 96% completion, lowest psychological casualty rate in program history. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a satisfaction that was different from anything I'd experienced during my active service years. Training successful agents provided its own form of fulfillment, knowing that dozens of men and women were now serving their country more effectively because of lessons learned in my classroom. "The family integration protocols are working," I replied. "Agents who maintain authentic relationships during training show significantly better resilience during extended assignments." Speaking of family integration, Wells said with the slight smile that usually preceded important news, "I have something to discuss with you. The deputy director position is opening up next month. Henderson is finally retiring." The offer hung in the air between us like a challenge. Deputy Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, third highest position in the organization, responsible for overseeing operations that shaped American foreign policy across 6 continents. It was the kind of career pinnacle I dreamed about during my early years as an operative, the ultimate validation of my service and capabilities. It would also mean longer hours, frequent travel, briefings with cabinet members and congressional committees, responsibility for decisions that could affect thousands of lives. It would mean less time for Miguel's senior year of high school, fewer family dinners, missed soccer games and parent-teacher conferences, and all the ordinary moments I'd fought so hard to reclaim. "That's quite an honor," I said carefully. "You're the obvious choice," Wells continued. "Your operational experience is unmatched, your training innovations have revolutionized how we prepare agents for long-term assignments, and your security clearance is already at the appropriate level. The transition could happen as early as next month." I thought about Miguel, now 17 and thriving at his Virginia high school, captain of the soccer team and president of the Model United Nations Club. He'd grown into the kind of young man who made thoughtful decisions and treated everyone with respect, who understood that his mother's work was important but never doubted that he was more important to her than any assignment. I thought about Diana, who'd become one of my closest confidants over the past 2 years, calling regularly to discuss everything from work challenges to relationship advice to shared concerns about Mom's health. She'd visited 6 times since we'd moved to Virginia, developing a genuine relationship with Miguel that went far beyond obligatory aunt duties. I thought about Carlos, who'd surprised everyone by taking early retirement from real estate development to focus on community service projects, inspired by conversations we'd had about finding meaning in work that helped others rather than just generating profit. He'd started a nonprofit organization that helped military veterans transition to civilian careers, drawing on insights he'd gained from watching my own difficult re-entry into family life. And I thought about Mom, now 81 and still living independently in Phoenix, but increasingly dependent on family support for medical appointments and household maintenance. Diana and Carlos had been sharing those responsibilities, but they both had their own careers and families to manage. "It's an incredible opportunity," I said finally, "but I need some time to think about it." Director Wells nodded, understanding the considerations I couldn't articulate directly. "Of course, take the time you need, but Sophia, opportunities like this don't come around often. You'd be the first Latina to hold the position, the youngest deputy director in agency history. You'd be shaping intelligence policy for the next decade." After she left, I sat alone in my office as the afternoon light faded beyond my windows, wrestling with a decision that felt like a test of everything I'd learned about balancing service and family, duty and love, professional ambition and personal fulfillment. My phone buzzed with a text from Miguel: "Practice running late again, home by 7 for dinner," followed immediately by another message: "Aunt Diana called, wants to know if we're still planning Phoenix trip for Thanksgiving." The Phoenix trip. We'd been making the journey every few months since Dad's funeral, building relationships that grew stronger with each visit. Miguel had developed a close bond with his grandmother, spending hours listening to her stories about Dad's younger days, about the dreams and challenges that had shaped the man I'd never fully understood while he was alive. These visits had become anchoring points in our lives, reminders of where we'd come from and how far we'd traveled together. Miguel loved exploring the desert landscapes of his mother's childhood, understanding the environment that had shaped my earliest dreams of seeing the world beyond Arizona's borders. But accepting the deputy director position would mean fewer trips, less flexibility, reduced ability to be present for the family relationships we'd worked so hard to rebuild. It would mean returning to the kind of compartmentalized existence I'd lived for 15 years, where work obligations consistently trumped personal commitments. My laptop chimed with an encrypted email from one of my former trainees, now 3 months into her first assignment in Southeast Asia. "Agent Martinez," the message began, "wanted to update you on how the family communication protocols are working in the field. Weekly video calls with my parents have made all the difference in maintaining psychological stability. The loneliness is still challenging, but knowing I have authentic connections to return to makes the isolation bearable. Thank you for insisting that we practice these techniques during training." The message was exactly the kind of feedback that made my current work meaningful. I wasn't just teaching tactical skills or operational procedures, I was helping agents maintain their humanity while serving their country, preventing the kind of identity dissolution that had nearly cost me my relationship with Miguel and my connection to my family. At 7 o'clock, Miguel burst through our front door with the energy that came from successful soccer practice and the anticipation of sharing good news. He'd grown 6 inches in the past 2 years, his voice had deepened, and he'd developed the kind of quiet confidence that came from being secure in his relationships and clear about his values. "How was practice?" I asked, closing my laptop and giving him my full attention. "Coach says college scouts are going to start attending our games next month, and guess what? The girl I've been talking to in AP History asked if I wanted to study together for the midterm exam." Normal teenage excitement, the kind of everyday victories that mattered more than any intelligence operation I'd ever conducted. Miguel had become the kind of young man who balanced academic achievement with athletic success and social connections, who treated everyone with respect regardless of their social status or background. "That's wonderful, Miguel. Are you nervous about the college scouts?" "A little, but mostly excited. And Mom, I've been thinking about what I want to study, international relations, maybe with a minor in computer science. I want to understand how the world works, maybe follow in your footsteps someday." The casual mention of following my career path sent a chill through me. Miguel had grown up thinking his mother was a translator, then learned she was actually a CIA operative, then watched her transition to training other agents. The intelligence world was the only government service he'd observed closely, and his interest felt both natural and terrifying. "There are many ways to serve your country," I said carefully. "Intelligence work requires significant personal sacrifices that aren't right for everyone." Miguel studied my expression with the perceptiveness that came from being raised by someone who'd learned to read people for a living. "Mom, are you worried about something? You've seemed distracted lately." I considered how much to share with him about Director Wells' offer, about the decision that could reshape our lives once again. Miguel was mature for his age, but he was still 17, still forming his own dreams and plans for the future. How much should those plans be influenced by his mother's career choices? "I might have an opportunity for a promotion," I said finally. "It would mean more responsibility, longer hours, probably some travel. Like back when I was little?" The question hit me harder than I'd expected. Back when he was little, and thought I was unreliable, when he'd learned not to count on me for school events or bedtime stories, when he'd developed the kind of self-sufficiency that came from having a parent who disappeared without adequate explanation. "Different from that," I said, "more predictable, but still demanding." Miguel nodded thoughtfully while setting the table for dinner, a routine we'd established after moving to Virginia. He'd become an excellent cook over the past 2 years, taking pride in contributing to our household management in ways that went beyond typical teenage chores. "Can I tell you something, Mom?" he said as we sat down to eat. "I'm proud of the work you're doing now, teaching other agents, helping them avoid some of the mistakes you had to learn from. It feels like you're making things better for families like ours." His insight surprised me with its maturity and accuracy. Training agents to maintain family connections wasn't just about improving their psychological resilience, it was about preventing other children from growing up feeling abandoned by parents whose service they couldn't understand, preventing other families from years of misunderstanding and missed opportunities for connection. "Thank you for saying that," I replied. "It means a lot to hear that you understand why this work matters." After dinner, while Miguel completed homework in his room, I called Diana to discuss Director Wells' offer and the considerations weighing on my decision. My sister had become an invaluable advisor over the past 2 years, someone who understood both my professional ambitions and my commitment to family relationships. "It sounds like an incredible opportunity," she said after I'd explained the position and its requirements. "But it also sounds like it might require you to choose between career advancement and being present for Miguel's senior year." That's exactly the dilemma. I've spent 2 years learning how to balance my career with family relationships. Taking this position might mean sacrificing that balance for professional achievement. Diana was quiet for a moment, probably thinking about her own career decisions and the trade-offs she'd made between ambition and personal fulfillment. When she spoke again, her voice carried the wisdom that came from her own experience, navigating executive responsibilities while maintaining meaningful relationships. "What does Miguel think?" she asked. "I haven't told him about the position yet. He's got college applications and senior year activities to focus on. I don't want my career uncertainty to become his burden." "Sophia, you've taught him that your work matters. That service to something greater than yourself is important. But you've also shown him that family relationships are sacred, that you'll prioritize his needs when it really counts. Maybe you should trust him to help you think through this decision." After we hung up, I found myself reviewing the psychological profiles of next year's training candidates, young men and women who'd volunteered for careers that would test every assumption they had about themselves and their capabilities. Some would thrive under the pressure, developing skills and resilience that would serve them throughout their lives. Others would discover that the personal costs were higher than they'd anticipated, that service in the intelligence community required sacrifices they weren't prepared to make. My job was to help them understand those costs before they made irreversible commitments, to teach them strategies for maintaining their humanity while serving in dehumanizing environments, to show them that effectiveness as an agent didn't require abandoning the relationships that gave their work meaning. But what did it mean if I accepted a position that would force me to practice exactly the kind of compartmentalization I'd been teaching them to avoid? The next morning, I found Miguel in the kitchen making breakfast before school, a domestic routine that had become one of my favorite parts of each day. He moved around our kitchen with practiced efficiency, preparing meals that reflected both his Mexican heritage and his Virginia upbringing, creating fusion dishes that somehow represented the complexity of our blended identity. "Miguel," I said, sitting at our kitchen island with my coffee, "I want to talk to you about something." He looked up from the eggs he was scrambling, his expression immediately attentive. The seriousness in my voice had triggered the kind of focused attention he'd learned to give when important family discussions were beginning. I told him about Director Wells' offer, about the responsibilities and opportunities that came with the deputy director position, about the potential impact on our family life and his remaining time at home before college. I explained the decision-making process I was navigating, the considerations that made this choice more complex than simple professional advancement. Miguel listened without interrupting, processing information with the thoughtfulness that came from being raised to understand that important decisions required careful consideration of multiple perspectives and long-term consequences. When I finished explaining the situation, he was quiet for several minutes, finishing breakfast preparation while thinking through everything I'd shared. Finally, he turned to face me directly, his expression serious but calm. "Mom, do you want the job?" "Yes," I admitted. It would be challenging and meaningful work, the kind of position I dreamed about when I first joined the agency. "Then I think you should take it." His immediate support surprised me. I'd expected him to advocate for maintaining our current stability, to prioritize his senior year activities over my career ambitions. "Miguel, this position would mean less flexibility, more demanding schedules, probably some travel. It might mean missing some of your games and school events." He smiled, and I saw my father's wisdom in his young face. "Mom, you've been at every important event for the past 2 years. You've never missed a parent-teacher conference, never been absent when I really needed you. I trust that you'll figure out how to balance this new job with being my mother. But what if I can't? What if the demands of the position force me to make the same kinds of choices I made when you were younger?" Miguel considered this question while pouring orange juice, his movements deliberate and thoughtful. "Then you'll handle it the same way you handled it before, except this time I'll understand what you're doing and why it matters. The difference isn't the work, Mom, the difference is the honesty." His insight took my breath away. He was right, of course. The problem during his childhood hadn't been my career demands or my irregular schedule. The problem had been the secrecy, the inability to explain why I was leaving or when I'd return, the necessity of maintaining cover stories that prevented authentic communication about what mattered most in our lives. But this position wouldn't require me to lie about my work or disappear without explanation. Miguel would understand when I had to travel, why certain meetings were essential, how my responsibilities connected to larger questions of national security. The work would still be demanding, but it wouldn't require me to sacrifice honesty for operational security. Are you sure about this? I asked. Your senior year is important. College applications, graduation, all the milestones we've been looking forward to sharing. I'm sure, and Mom, I want to tell you something else. I've been researching colleges with strong international relations programs because I think I might want to work in government someday, not necessarily the CIA, but maybe the State Department or Foreign Service. Watching you serve your country has shown me that there are ways to make a meaningful difference in the world. The revelation that my career had inspired rather than deterred his own interest in public service filled me with a pride that was different from any professional achievement. Miguel had grown up understanding that service required sacrifice, that meaningful work sometimes demanded personal costs, but he'd also learned that those sacrifices could be worthwhile if they contributed to something larger than individual success. That afternoon, I scheduled a meeting with Director Wells to accept her offer. The decision felt right in a way that was both rational and instinctive, based on careful consideration of family priorities, but also driven by recognition that this opportunity aligned perfectly with my skills, experience, and commitment to improving how the intelligence community prepared and supported its personnel. The transition would take place over 6 weeks, allowing me to complete training responsibilities for my current class, while gradually assuming oversight of operations that spanned continents and affected millions of lives. It was exactly the kind of complex challenge that had attracted me to intelligence work in the first place, but now I approached it with wisdom earned through years of learning to balance competing priorities. Miguel's response had been crucial in helping me recognize that the choice wasn't between family and career, but between honest service and compartmentalized existence. As deputy director, I would still face difficult decisions and demanding schedules, but I would face them as Sophia Martinez rather than Agent Martinez, as a whole person rather than someone playing a role. 3 weeks later, I stood in the same auditorium where I'd watched my trainees graduate, now being sworn in as the youngest deputy director in CIA history. Miguel sat in the front row, wearing the suit Diana had bought him for the occasion, his face glowing with pride as he watched his mother accept responsibilities that would shape American intelligence operations for years to come. Diana and Carlos had flown in from Phoenix for the ceremony, bringing Mom despite her reluctance to travel at her age. My entire family was there to witness this milestone, understanding finally that my career had always been about service rather than self-advancement, about protecting people like them rather than abandoning them for professional achievement. Director Wells administered the oath with the solemnity appropriate for someone assuming oversight of operations that could mean the difference between peace and conflict, security and vulnerability, for millions of Americans who would never know the details of the work being done on their behalf. After the ceremony, as guests mingled in the reception hall and I accepted congratulations from colleagues and dignitaries, Miguel appeared at my side with a small wrapped package. "What's this?" I asked, curious about the timing of his gift. "Something for your new office," he said. "Open it." Inside was a framed photograph I'd never seen before, showing our extended family at last month's barbecue in our Virginia backyard. Mom was sitting in a lawn chair, surrounded by Diana, Carlos, Miguel, and me, all of us laughing at something Miguel had said. We looked like people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company, who had overcome significant obstacles to create meaningful connections. At the bottom of the frame, Miguel had inscribed a simple message, for the deputy director who never forgot that the most important job is being part of a family. I hugged my son, this remarkable young man who'd grown up thinking his mother was a failure, and had learned instead that she was someone who'd spent years protecting the very family relationships she'd seemed to neglect. He understood now that service and love weren't mutually exclusive, that the highest forms of achievement involved finding ways to contribute to something greater than yourself without sacrificing the connections that made life meaningful. Around us, intelligence officers and government officials continued their conversations about global threats and operational priorities, the complex challenges that would define my work for the foreseeable future. But at the center of it all was this truth that Miguel had helped me understand the work only mattered because it protected the ability of families to gather in backyards and share meals and celebrate each other's achievements. Over the following months, as I settled into my new responsibilities, and Miguel navigated his senior year with the confidence that came from having a mother who was finally able to be completely honest about her career, I realized that the greatest victory hadn't been accepting the deputy director position. It had been learning that success could be redefined, that achievement could include authenticity, that serving your country could coexist with serving your family if you were willing to reject the false choice between duty and love. Miguel graduated as valedictorian of his class, delivering a commencement speech about service and sacrifice that left half the audience in tears. He'd been accepted to Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, where he planned to study international relations and prepare for a career in diplomacy. As I watched him walk across that graduation stage, I thought about the young woman who'd left Phoenix 20 years ago with dreams of making a difference in the world, who'd sacrificed personal relationships for professional achievement, who'd nearly lost everything that mattered while trying to save people she'd never meet. That woman had accomplished extraordinary things, prevented disasters and saved lives and served her country with distinction. But the woman sitting in the graduation audience, watching her son prepare for his own career in public service, had accomplished something even more extraordinary. She'd learned that the most important intelligence operation was the one that happened around kitchen tables and in backyard barbecues, and during quiet conversations between parents and children who trusted each other enough to be honest about what mattered most. The mission continued, but now it included coming home every night to the people who made all the other work worthwhile. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.